The woman collapsed against his porch, just as the wind began its terrible howl. Her dark hair plastered to her face with snow and ice. Fingers blue beneath torn gloves that had offered no protection against the Wyoming winter. Brennan heard the thump from inside his cabin where he had been stoking the fire, preparing for what looked to be the worst blizzard of 1885. And when he opened the door, the wind nearly ripped it from his hands. She lay crumpled like a rag doll, her lips the color of slate, her traveling dress shredded and inadequate for the brutal cold that swept down from the mountains. He did not hesitate. Ethan scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt, how fragile, and kicked the door shut behind them. The howling wind became muffled, contained outside where it belonged, and he carried her to the fireplace, laying her on the worn rug before the flames. Her skin felt like marble under his rough hands as he worked quickly, removing her wet cloak and the soaked layers beneath. His movements efficient and impersonal, born of necessity rather than any improper intent. He wrapped her in his own blankets, thick wool that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and began rubbing her hands and feet to restore circulation. "Come on now," he muttered, watching her face for any sign of consciousness. "Do not die on me. I have had enough death in this cabin." The fire crackled and spit, throwing dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the blizzard descended in earnest, the kind of storm that could last for days, that could bury a man's entire homestead under drifts taller than horses. Ethan had seen it before, had lived through winters that claimed the unprepared and the unlucky. He wondered which category this woman fell into as he continued his ministrations, refusing to give up even as minutes stretched into an hour with no response. Then she coughed. It was a weak, rattling sound, but it was life, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Her eyelids fluttered and he leaned closer, still rubbing warmth back into her hands. "Easy," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. He lived alone, spoke mostly to his horses, and visitors were rare this far from Kelton proper. "You are safe. You are inside." Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of spring grass, startling in their clarity. She stared at him without comprehension at first, her gaze distant and confused, then suddenly panicked. She tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate, and Ethan gently pressed her back down. "Rest," he commanded. "You nearly froze to death. Where were you headed?" She opened her mouth, but only a croak emerged. Ethan rose and fetched water from the kettle he kept warming by the fire, helping her take small sips. The water seemed to help, and after a moment she tried again. "Kelton," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was going to Kelton. My stagecoach overturned. The others. The driver said to wait, but then he did not come back. I tried to find help. I walked and walked." "How long ago?" "Yesterday morning, I think. I am not certain." Everything became white. Ethan's jaw tightened. A full day in that cold, walking in circles most likely. It was a miracle she had found his cabin at all, tucked as it was in a small valley between ridges. The stagecoach route was a good 5 miles east, though in a blizzard directions meant nothing. "The others?" he asked. She closed her eyes and he saw tears squeeze from beneath her lids. "The driver and another passenger. A man. They were hurt when the coach went over. I do not know if they survived. I should have stayed, but I was so cold and the driver said to find help to get to Kelton." "You did what you could," Ethan said, though he knew the truth was grimmer. If they had been injured and exposed for a full day and night in this weather, they were certainly dead. He would look when the storm cleared, but he held little hope. "What is your name?" "Thea," she said. "Thea Gardiner." "From Boston." "Boston." That explained the impractical clothing, the clear unfamiliarity with frontier weather. Ethan had met plenty of Easterners who came west with romantic notions and insufficient preparation. Most learned quickly or died trying. "I am Ethan Brennan," he said. "You are at my ranch about 3 miles south of Kelton. We are stuck here until this storm passes. Could be days." Thea's eyes widened. "Days. But I must get to town. I am expected. There is a position waiting for me teaching at the schoolhouse. They will think I am not coming. They will think you are dead, along with everyone else on that stagecoach," Ethan said bluntly. "When this clears, I will ride into town and let them know you survived. Until then, you stay put and recover. Understood?" She looked like she wanted to argue, but another fit of coughing seized her, and she could only nod weakly. Ethan fetched more blankets and built up the fire, then set about preparing soup from the venison he had hanging in the cold room. The cabin was small but well built, with sturdy walls that kept out the worst of the wind and a good roof that did not leak. He had built it himself 7 years ago when he first claimed this land, had poured his sweat and hopes into every log and nail. As the soup simmered, Ethan studied his unexpected guest more carefully. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with a delicate face that spoke of a life lived indoors, away from the harsh sun and wind that weathered everyone out here. Her hands, even chapped and damaged from exposure, were smooth, uncalloused. A teacher from Boston. She seemed as out of place as a rose in a snowdrift. "Why Wyoming?" he asked as he ladled soup into a bowl. Thea had been dozing but opened her eyes at his question. "Opportunity," she said simply. "An escape." He handed her the bowl and she sat up slowly, wincing. Her muscles would be sore from the cold and exertion. She took the soup gratefully, sipping carefully. "What were you escaping?" Ethan asked, settling into his chair with his own bowl. The question was forward, perhaps too personal, but out here, pretense seemed wasteful. Thea was quiet for a long moment, and he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "A marriage I did not want, my father's debts, a life that felt like a cage." She met his eyes directly. The school board's letter felt like a key, a chance to be something other than an ornament or a solution to someone else's problems. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that impulse, that need to escape. It was why he had come west himself, though his reasons were darker, stained with memories he tried not to revisit. "You picked a hard place for freedom," he said. "Freedom is never easy," Thea replied, and there was steel beneath the refined accent, a core of strength that had kept her walking through a blizzard instead of lying down to die. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the walls. Ethan stood and checked the windows, making sure the drifts were not blocking the door. They had food enough for a siege and firewood stacked high, but a man could still die of carelessness in weather like this. When he returned to the fire, Thea had finished her soup and was watching him with those startling green eyes. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes. No family, not anymore." He said it flatly, closing that door before she could open it further. She seemed to understand, nodding and pulling the blankets tighter around herself. "Thank you for saving my life. I know I have brought trouble to your door." "The trouble was already coming," Ethan said, gesturing to the window where snow was rapidly obscuring the glass. "You just arrived with it." That drew a small smile from her, the first he had seen. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the pallor and exhaustion. Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden warmth that smile created in his chest. He had been alone too long, clearly, if a smile from a half-frozen stranger could affect him. The first night passed slowly. Thea slept fitfully, occasionally crying out from dreams Ethan could only imagine. He dozed in his chair, keeping the fire stoked, checking on her periodically to ensure she was not developing fever or worse symptoms of exposure. By morning, if the gray light filtering through the storm could be called morning, she seemed better. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she could sit up without assistance. "I need to see to the horses," Ethan said after they had shared a breakfast of biscuits and coffee. "The barn is connected by a rope line. I will not be gone long." "Be careful," Thea said, and there was genuine concern in her voice. The barn was only 30 yards from the cabin, but in the whiteout conditions, it might as well have been 30 miles without the rope to guide him. Ethan bundled himself in his heavy coat and pulled on his hat, then stepped into the maelstrom. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. He followed the rope hand over hand, snow stinging his face like needles, until he reached the barn door and pulled it open just enough to slip inside. His 3 horses nickered greetings, and he checked each one carefully, ensuring they had water and feed. The barn was cold but protected from the wind, and the animals seemed comfortable enough. He mucked the stalls and spread fresh hay, talking to them in the quiet, soothing tones they knew. This was his routine, the rhythm that had sustained him through years of solitude. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, Thea had tidied the sleeping area and was attempting to braid her hair with clumsy fingers. She looked up at his entrance. "Everything well?" she asked. "Well enough. We have provisions for the animals and ourselves. No need to worry." "I am not worried," Thea said. "Not anymore. This cabin feels safer than anywhere I have been in a long time." Ethan did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, busying himself with removing his outer layers and checking the firewood supply. The day stretched ahead, long and confined. He was used to solitude but not to sharing his space, and he felt oddly self-conscious as Thea moved about the small cabin, exploring with careful courtesy. "You have built a good home," she said, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table he had made. "Everything is so carefully crafted." "Man has to occupy himself somehow," Ethan replied. She picked up a small carving from the mantel, a horse mid-gallop, perfectly detailed. "You made this winter project few years back." "It is beautiful. You have real talent." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. He had never shown his carvings to anyone, had made them purely for his own satisfaction. Having someone examine them felt too intimate, like she was reading his private thoughts. Thea seemed to sense his discomfort and set the carving down gently. "I am sorry. I do not mean to pry. I am just curious by nature. My mother always said it would get me into trouble." "Seems like it already has," Ethan said, but his tone was not unkind. She laughed, a bright sound that seemed to push back the gloom of the storm outside. "I suppose you are right." They fell into an easier silence after that. Ethan worked on repairing a bridle that needed mending while Thea discovered his small collection of books and settled near the fire to read. The quiet was companionable rather than awkward, and Ethan found himself relaxing incrementally, his usual wariness fading. "Where did you learn to read?" he asked after a while, surprising himself with the question. Thea looked up from the volume of poetry she had been studying. "My mother taught me when I was young. She was educated, believed girls should be too, even though my father thought it was foolishness. After she died, I kept reading in secret. The library became my refuge. When did she die? I was 14. Influenza." Thea's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan heard the old grief beneath it. "After that, my father changed, became harder, more concerned with appearances and advantageous matches than anything else. That when he arranged the marriage, not until this year. I am 23 now. Quite old to be unmarried by Boston standards." She smiled wryly. I thought I had escaped it, but debts have a way of forcing decisions. He found a wealthy man willing to overlook my advanced age and independent streak in exchange for respectability. I was to be married in June. So you ran. So I ran, she confirmed. Saw the advertisement for a teacher in Wyoming, wrote immediately, and left the day I received their acceptance. I have never done anything so impulsive or so terrifying in my life. Takes courage, Ethan said. Coming out here alone, or stupidity. The jury is still out on which. She paused, studying him with open curiosity. What brought you west? Ethan's hands stilled on the bridle. He had known the question would come eventually, the natural reciprocity of shared confidences. He could refuse to answer, but something about Thea's honesty compelled his own. My family had a farm in Missouri, he said slowly. My parents and younger sister. I was 20, full of myself, thought I knew better than my father about everything. We fought about how to run the place, about which crops to plant, about money. Stupid arguments that seemed important at the time. He paused, the old pain rising like bile. Thea waited silently, giving him space. I left, he continued. Told them I would make my own way, prove I did not need their help. I was gone 3 months. When I came back, the farm was burned. Raiders had come through, taken everything, killed everyone. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. I buried what was left of them under the oak tree my mother loved. Then I sold the land for whatever I could get and headed west. Did not stop until I found this place. That was 7 years ago. Oh, Ethan, Thea said softly. I am so sorry. Sorry does not change anything, he said, returning his attention to the bridle with sharp, angry movements. They died while I was proving a point to no one but myself. That is a fact I live with every day. It was not your fault. Was not it? He looked up, meeting her eyes. If I had been there, maybe I could have done something, fought them off, warned the others, something. Or you would be dead too, Thea said gently. Random violence does not follow logic or fairness. You cannot blame yourself for not being there when evil came calling. I can blame myself for the pride that took me away in the first place. Thea was quiet for a moment, then said, Then I suppose I should blame myself for the weakness that let my father control me for so long, or for not being brave enough to leave sooner, before I was trapped by his debts. We can blame ourselves for all sorts of things, Ethan, but it will not change what happened. It will only make the present heavier. Her words struck something in him, a truth he had not wanted to acknowledge. He had been carrying his guilt like a stone for 7 years, letting it weigh down every moment, every decision. It had become so familiar he had forgotten it was a choice. How did you get so wise? He asked, trying to lighten the moment. Books, she said with a small smile. And hardship. The combination tends to teach lessons whether you want them or not. The storm continued through that day and into the next, an unrelenting assault of wind and snow that turned the world into a white void. Ethan and Thea settled into a routine born of necessity and growing comfort with each other. He managed the physical work of maintaining the cabin and caring for the animals while she took over cooking and tidying, bringing an order to his bachelor existence that he had not realized was missing. They talked during the long evenings, carefully at first, then with increasing openness. Thea told him about Boston, about cobblestone streets and crowded markets, about the smell of the harbor and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. She painted pictures with her words, and Ethan found himself fascinated by this world so different from his own. In turn, he told her about the land, about the rhythm of the seasons and the hard work of building something from nothing. He showed her his carpentry projects, his leather working, the small ways he had learned to be self-sufficient. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaged rather than merely being polite. On the third day, the wind finally began to diminish. The snow still fell, but the furious howling had faded to a softer whisper. Ethan checked the door and found he could open it partway, though the drift was still high. "Another day at least before I can dig us out proper," he said. "But the worst has passed. Part of me is glad," Thea admitted. She was standing near the window looking out at the white landscape. "Is that terrible? I know I need to get to Kelton to take up my position, but these past days have been peaceful in a way I have not experienced in years." Ethan understood. He had felt it too, the strange contentment of being snowed in with someone who asked nothing of him except honest conversation. It was a respite from the loneliness he usually did not let himself acknowledge. "Kelton will still be there when the snow clears," he said. She turned to look at him, and something passed between them, an awareness that had been building since she first opened her eyes in his cabin. Ethan felt his heart rate increase, felt the sudden tension in the air that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Ethan," Thea said quietly, "I need to thank you properly. You saved my life and asked nothing in return. You have shared your home and your food and your stories. I am more grateful than I can express." "You do not owe me anything," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Any decent person would have done the same." "I am not so sure about that. The world has fewer decent people than we would like to believe." She crossed the small space between them, moving with a grace that made his mouth go dry. "But I think you are one of them, even if you do not see it yourself." She reached up and touched his face, her hand cool and soft against his bearded cheek. Ethan stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to step back, to maintain the distance that had kept him safe for 7 years. But he could not move, could not look away from those green eyes that saw too much. "Thea," he said, but he did not know what else to say, how to finish that thought. She smiled, sad and knowing. "I know. I am leaving as soon as the weather permits. But until then, can we not pretend that the world outside does not exist? That we are just two people who found each other in the storm?" It was a dangerous question, tempting in its simplicity. Ethan knew he should refuse, should rebuild the walls she had so effortlessly scaled. But he was tired of being alone, tired of punishing himself, and Thea was looking at him like he was something precious rather than something broken. He covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. He heard her sharp intake of breath, felt her fingers curl against his skin. Then he was pulling her closer, and she was coming willingly, fitting against him like she had been made for that exact purpose. Their first kiss was tentative, questioning, both of them testing the waters of this unexpected thing growing between them. But the second kiss was different, deeper, filled with the hunger of two people who had been starving without realizing it. Ethan tangled his hands in her hair, still damp from melted snow, and Thea pressed closer, her arms wrapping around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "This is foolish," he said. "Probably," Thea agreed, "but I find I do not care." They spent that night together, not coupling but simply holding each other, finding comfort in shared warmth and the steady rhythm of another heartbeat. Ethan had forgotten what it felt like to sleep beside someone, to wake in the night and find another person there, real and solid. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Morning brought clearer skies and the hard work of digging out. Ethan broke a path to the barn first, then began the arduous process of clearing the area around the cabin. The snow was deep, in places higher than his waist, and the work was exhausting. Thea helped where she could, though her Eastern upbringing had not prepared her for this kind of labor. By afternoon, Ethan had cleared enough space and judged the conditions safe enough to attempt the ride to Kelton. He saddled his most reliable horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, and told Thea he would return by nightfall. "I will tell them you are alive and will come to town when you are stronger," he said. "Probably a few days yet. The roads will need to clear more and you need to recover your full strength." "Thank you," Thea said. She had been quiet all day and Ethan wondered if she regretted the intimacy they had shared. But when she looked at him, her eyes were warm. "Be safe." The ride to Kelton took twice as long as usual, with Copper having to break trail through the deep snow. The town, when Ethan finally reached it, was a flurry of activity. People were digging out, checking on neighbors, dealing with the aftermath of the storm. He headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Morrison looked up when Ethan entered, surprise crossing his weathered face. "Ethan Brennan, been a while since you graced us with your presence." "Got news about the stagecoach that went missing," Ethan said without preamble. "Woman named Thea Gardiner survived. She is at my place recovering. Says the coach overturned, driver and another passenger were hurt. This was 3 days back, east of my land." Morrison's expression turned grim. "We found the coach yesterday when the wind died down enough to search. Found 2 bodies, like she said. Driver and a drummer from Cheyenne. Both froze to death. We figured everyone on board was dead." He paused. "She all right, she will be. Needs a few more days rest before traveling. I said I would bring her to town when she is ready." "Good, good." Morrison studied him carefully. "The schoolmarm is not she. Mrs. Patterson has been beside herself, thinking her new teacher was dead. She will be relieved to hear otherwise." Ethan nodded and turned to leave, but Morrison stopped him. "Ethan, good of you to take her in. Not everyone would." "Could not very well leave her on my porch to freeze," Ethan said gruffly. Morrison smiled slightly. "No, I suppose not, but still, good of you." Ethan made a few more stops, picking up supplies and spreading the news of Thea's survival. Everywhere he went, people expressed relief and curiosity in equal measure. He deflected their questions as best he could, and started the long ride back as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Thea had dinner waiting when he returned, the cabin warm and welcoming. She took his coat and helped him out of his boots, fussing over him in a way that felt both foreign and right. "The town is fine," he reported as they sat down to eat. "Found the stagecoach and the others. They did not make it. I am sorry." Thea closed her eyes briefly, her face pained. "I feared as much. Did they have families?" Driver was a bachelor. "The other man had a wife in Cheyenne. Sheriff is sending word." They ate in silence for a while, the weight of the deaths hanging between them. Then Thea said, "Mrs. Patterson, she is expecting me." "Yes." "She is the one who hired you, I assume. Sheriff said she was relieved to hear you survived. I told them you would come to town in a few days when you were stronger and the roads better." "A few days," Thea repeated softly. "Then this ends." "It does not have to," Ethan said, the words escaping before he could stop them. She looked up, hope and fear warring in her expression. "What are you saying?" He had not planned this, had not thought through what he wanted or what was possible. But sitting there across from her in his cabin that no longer felt lonely, Ethan knew he could not let her walk away without trying. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just until spring. Longer, as long as you want." "Ethan, I have a job waiting, people counting on me. You could still teach." "It is only 3 miles to town. People make that ride every day. And what would I be here, your housekeeper? That is not any different than what I ran from." He winced at the sharpness in her voice, but he understood it. She had not fled one cage to enter another. "No, not a housekeeper. A partner. Someone who shares this life with me, builds something together rather than alone." Thea stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. You are talking about marriage. Eventually, maybe, if that is what you want, but even if not, just stay. Live here, teach in town, be free in the way you wanted to be. I am not trying to trap you, Thea. I am trying to offer you a choice. She stopped pacing and looked at him, really looked at him. Why? Because I have been half alive for 7 years, Ethan said, the honesty costing him but feeling necessary. Because you walked into my cabin with a blizzard and woke something in me I thought was dead. Because when I think about you leaving, going to some boarding house in town, seeing you only in passing, it makes me feel like I am losing something I did not know I could have. Tears spilled down Thea's cheeks, and she wiped at them impatiently. I feel it too, but I am afraid. I came here to be independent, to make my own way. If I stay with you, if I let myself love you, am I just repeating old patterns? I do not know, Ethan admitted. But I know you would be staying because you chose to, not because anyone forced you. And I know I would never ask you to be anything less than yourself. Your teaching, your reading, your thoughts and opinions, I want all of it. I want you. She crossed to him then, and he stood to meet her. She took his hands, holding them tightly. I need time. I need to take up my position in town, prove to myself that I can do this thing I came here to do. I need to be sure that staying with you is about wanting to, not about being afraid to be alone. How much time? Ethan asked, even though the thought of waiting was painful. Until spring, Thea said. Let me teach through the winter. Come spring, when the world thaws, I will give you my answer. It was not what he wanted, but it was fair, and Ethan respected her need for certainty. Until spring, then, but I am not going to make it easy for you to say no. She laughed, watery but genuine. I would not expect anything less. 3 days later, Ethan brought Thea into Kelton. She rode behind him on Copper, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. He had never been so aware of another person, of every breath and movement. When they reached the edge of town, she reluctantly let go, and he helped her down. Mrs. Patterson was a whirlwind of relief and chatter, sweeping Thea into a boarding house and immediately beginning to fuss over her. Ethan stood back, suddenly uncertain of his place in this world of domesticity and social niceties. Thea looked back at him before disappearing inside, and the longing in her eyes matched his own. The winter that followed was the longest and shortest of Ethan's life. He threw himself into work, preparing for spring planting and tending to his animals. But twice a week, he found excuses to ride into Kelton. Sometimes it was for supplies, sometimes to help with repairs after another storm, and sometimes he simply went because he needed to see Thea. She settled into her teaching with a passion that was beautiful to witness. The children adored her, and she transformed the small schoolhouse into a place of wonder and learning. Ethan would sometimes arrive early and watch through the window as she taught, her face animated, her hands gesturing as she brought history and literature to life. In the evenings, when her work was done, they would walk together through the town or sit in the boarding house parlor under Mrs. Patterson's watchful but approving eye. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other in the way of courting couples. Ethan had never courted anyone before, and he was clumsy at it, but Thea seemed charmed by his awkwardness. "You brought me a horseshoe," she said one evening in February, looking at the iron curve he had pressed into her hands. "It is good luck," Ethan explained, feeling foolish. "And I shaped it myself. See how the curve is even. That is harder than it looks." She turned it over in her hands, studying it with the same attention she gave to everything. Then she smiled that smile that made his heart race. "I love it. I shall keep it on my desk at school, and every time I see it, I shall think of you." He kissed her then, right there in the parlor, propriety be damned. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat loudly from the hallway, and they broke apart, both grinning like fools. As winter slowly released its grip and the first signs of spring began to appear, Ethan grew increasingly anxious. They had not spoken of her decision since that first night, but it hung between them, a question that would soon demand an answer. He tried to prepare himself for the possibility that she would say no, that her independence and her work would matter more than what they had built together. He told himself he would accept it, would let her go without complaint, but he knew it would break something in him. In mid-March, the first true thaw arrived. Snow melted into rushing streams and the earth began to soften. Green shoots appeared in sheltered spots, and the air smelled of possibility. Ethan rode into Kelton on a Saturday morning, his heart pounding with an urgency he could not name. He found Thea at the schoolhouse, cleaning after the week's lessons. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression told him she had been expecting him. "It is spring," he said unnecessarily. "It is," she agreed, setting down her broom. "Thea, I cannot wait any more. I know we said spring, and I am here to ask, will you stay with me? Will you take a chance on a broken-down cowboy who loves you more than he knows how to say?" She walked toward him slowly, and Ethan felt every second stretch into eternity. Then she was standing before him, reaching up to touch his face the way she had that first time in his cabin. "Yes," she said simply, "I will stay. I will marry you and build a life with you and be your partner in all things, because these past months have taught me that independence is not about being alone. It is about choosing who you stand beside. And I choose you, Ethan Brennan. I will always choose you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he was afraid he might hurt her, but she only held him back just as fiercely. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you. You already are," she whispered back. "You already are." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Kelton, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears, and even Sheriff Morrison cracked a smile. Thea wore a simple dress she had made herself, blue as the Wyoming sky, and Ethan wore his best clothes, pressed and clean. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her in front of everyone, claiming her and being claimed in return. The party afterwards was raucous and joyful, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible in a frontier town. But Ethan only had eyes for his wife, watching her laugh and dance and talk with their neighbors. She belonged here now, was woven into the fabric of this place as surely as he was. They had both come to Wyoming as refugees from their pasts, but they had found something neither had expected: a home and each other. That night, Ethan carried Thea over the threshold of the cabin that was now theirs. He had spent weeks preparing, building new furniture and making the space larger, trying to transform his bachelor existence into something worthy of sharing. She looked around at his efforts, at the new bed frame he had carved with intricate designs, at the expanded kitchen area, at the rocking chair he had made and placed by the window. "You did all this for me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "For us," he corrected. "Everything I do now is for us." They made love that night with a tenderness that grew into passion, learning each other's bodies as they had learned each other's hearts. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the darkness, Ethan felt a peace he had never known. The ghosts that had haunted him for 7 years seemed finally to rest, laid down by the love of the woman in his arms. Thea continued teaching, riding into Kelton 3 days a week while Ethan managed the ranch. They developed a rhythm, a partnership that balanced both their needs. On the days she taught, Ethan would finish his work early and ride in to meet her, and they would return home together in the fading light. On the other days, she helped him with the ranch work, learning to care for the horses and mend fences and all the 1,000 tasks that kept a homestead running. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, reading together or talking or simply being in each other's presence. Sometimes Ethan would work on his carving while Thea prepared lessons for her students. Sometimes she would read aloud to him, sharing the books that had sustained her through her difficult years in Boston. And sometimes they would do nothing but hold each other, grateful for the miracle that had brought them together. Their first winter as a married couple was harsh, with storms that rivaled the blizzard that had brought Thea to his door. But inside their cabin, there was warmth and laughter and love. They learned each other's moods and quirks, learned how to fight fair and make up afterwards, learned the daily work of building a marriage. In spring, Thea discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan one morning in May as they were working in the garden she had planted, and he stared at her in shock and wonder. "A baby," he said stupidly. "We are having a baby, we are," she confirmed, her face radiant. "In late autumn, I think. Are you happy?" Happy seemed inadequate for the explosion of feeling in his chest. He picked her up and spun her around, making her shriek with laughter. "I am terrified and thrilled and cannot believe I get to have this," he said when he set her down. "A family. With you. I did not think I deserved a second chance." "We all deserve second chances," Thea said, taking his hands and placing them on her still flat stomach. "This baby is proof of that, a new beginning for both of us." Thea taught through the summer, finally stopping when her pregnancy became too obvious to hide, and the school board insisted she rest. She chafed at the forced inactivity, but Ethan kept her busy helping him plan improvements to the cabin and the ranch. They built a cradle together, with Ethan doing the fine woodwork and Thea sewing blankets and tiny clothes. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving quickly and with minimal fuss, as if he was eager to join the world. Ethan delivered him with the help of Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on being present despite the long ride from town. When he placed the squalling, red-faced infant in Thea's arms, Ethan felt tears running down his face unchecked. "He is perfect," Thea said, her voice exhausted but full of wonder. "Look at him, Ethan. We made this miracle." They named him James after Ethan's father, and the baby became the center of their world. Ethan had never known he could love something so fiercely and protectively as he loved his son. He would watch James sleep for hours, marveling at the tiny fingers and the way the baby's face would scrunch up when he dreamed. Thea blossomed into motherhood, though she admitted to Ethan in quiet moments that it was harder than she had imagined. The sleepless nights, the constant demands, the fear that she was doing everything wrong. But together they muddled through, supporting each other and learning as they went. When spring came again, Thea began to talk about returning to teaching. Mrs. Patterson had been managing with a temporary replacement, but the town wanted their regular teacher back. Ethan was nervous about Thea leaving James, even for a few hours, but he understood her need to be more than just a mother, to maintain the independence she had fought so hard to claim. They worked out a solution. Ethan would watch James on the days Thea taught, bringing the baby with him as he did his work around the ranch. It was chaotic and exhausting, trying to care for an infant while managing animals and repairs, but Ethan found a deep satisfaction in it. This was his family, his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to make it work. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. James grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy who followed his father everywhere and peppered his mother with endless questions. 2 years after James, Thea gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. Then came another son, Michael, who was quiet and thoughtful, content to observe the world rather than demand its attention. The ranch prospered under Ethan's steady management and Thea's business sense. She took over the books and began making suggestions about breeding stock and market timing that proved invaluable. They expanded gradually, buying more land and building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. The original cabin became a storage shed, but they kept it maintained, a reminder of where they had started. Thea continued teaching until Sarah was born, then chose to stay home and focus on raising their children. She said she did not regret the decision, that watching her own children learn and grow was more rewarding than any classroom. But Ethan knew she sometimes missed it, so he made sure she stayed connected, hosting gatherings for the local families and their children, turning their home into an informal place of learning and community. The children grew, and life settled into the comfortable pattern of an established family. Ethan taught his sons to ride and rope and manage the ranch, while Thea made sure all three children could read and write and think critically. They raised them with love and discipline in equal measure, determined to give them the security and support neither parent had fully known in their own childhoods. When James turned 18, tall and capable and ready to take on more responsibility, Ethan realized with a shock how much time had passed. It had been nearly 20 years since that blizzard had brought Thea to his door, 20 years since he had asked her to stay until spring. She had stayed for far longer, had built an entire life with him, and he still woke some mornings unable to believe his good fortune. One evening in late summer, with the children occupied with their own pursuits, Ethan and Thea sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. Her hair had threads of silver now, and his beard was more gray than brown, but her hand in his still felt like coming home. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of pursuing your own dreams?" Thea looked at him with surprise. "What brought this on?" Just thinking about James, how grown he is, how fast it all went, wondering if you gave up too much for this life. She squeezed his hand, her expression tender. "Ethan Brennan, I have never regretted a single day. Yes, my life turned out differently than I imagined when I left Boston, but it turned out better, so much better. Teaching was my dream when I had no other options, when I thought independence meant being alone. But you taught me that I could be independent and still be part of something larger, that I could be myself and be your wife and be a mother. I did not give up my dreams. I found better ones." "I just want you to be happy," Ethan said. "I am happy," Thea assured him. "More than I ever thought possible. You gave me a home, a family, a love that has sustained me through everything. How could I regret that?" They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Ethan thought about the man he had been when Thea arrived, angry and isolated and convinced he deserved nothing good. She had changed him, had opened his heart and taught him that redemption was possible, that he could honor his lost family by building a new one rather than by wallowing in guilt. "I love you," he said, not for the first time but with no less feeling. "Thank you for staying." "I love you too," Thea replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for asking me to." As the years continued to pass, their children grew into their own lives. James married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over and started his own spread with his father's help. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, taking over the Kelton schoolhouse and bringing new ideas and energy to the role. Michael surprised everyone by developing a talent for veterinary medicine, apprenticing with a doctor in Cheyenne, before returning to serve the ranching community around Kelton. Ethan and Thea became grandparents, then great-grandparents as their family expanded. They downsized back to a smaller house, their bodies no longer up to maintaining the larger homestead, but they remained active and engaged. Ethan still carved, his gnarled hands producing beautiful pieces that their grandchildren treasured. Thea still read voraciously, keeping up with the changing world through books and newspapers, and she wrote long letters to far-flung family members, maintaining the connections that mattered. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that seemed to include half of Wyoming. Ethan stood before the crowd, embarrassed but touched by the outpouring of love, and tried to find words for what he felt. "Most of you know the story of how Thea and I met," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "How a blizzard brought her to my door, half frozen and lost. I told her to stay until spring, thinking that would be the end of it, but she stayed for life, and in doing so, she saved mine. Everything good I have, everything I am, comes from the day she chose to stay. So on this anniversary, I do not want to celebrate just our marriage. I want to celebrate the power of choosing love over fear, of taking chances on people and places and possibilities." Thea took a chance on a broken cowboy in the middle of nowhere, and look what we built together. The crowd erupted in applause, and Thea stood beside him, her eyes shining with tears. "He is leaving out the part where he took a chance on a foolish Easterner who did not know the first thing about surviving out here," she said when the noise died down. "Marriage is about both people choosing every day to stay, and I have chosen Ethan every day for 30 years. I will choose him for 30 more if I am lucky enough to have them." They danced that night, slow and careful but still graceful, lost in each other as they had been from the beginning. Their children watched with fond smiles, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious. A love that had endured despite hardship, that had grown deeper with each passing year rather than fading into comfortable routine. As they entered their later years, Ethan and Thea's health began to decline in the way that is natural and expected. Ethan's joints ached in the cold, and Thea's eyes grew dim despite her determination to keep reading. But they faced these challenges as they had faced everything, together, with grace and humor and stubborn refusal to give up. They celebrated their 40th anniversary quietly, just the two of them in the small house they had made their final home. Ethan had carved a new piece for the occasion, a man and woman standing together against a wind-blown landscape, holding each other against the storm. Thea cried when she saw it, recognizing immediately the scene he had captured, the moment they met, the moment that had changed everything. "We have had a good life," Ethan said that evening, holding her close. "Better than I deserved." "Better than either of us expected," Thea corrected. "But not better than we deserved. We worked for this, Ethan. We chose it and fought for it and built it with our own hands. We earned this happiness." "Maybe so," he conceded. "Still feels like a gift, though. You feel like a gift." "Then we are gifts to each other," Thea said. "The best kind, the kind you do not expect but cannot imagine living without." Ethan passed away first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Thea holding his hand and his family surrounding him. The entire community mourned, for he had been respected and loved, a man who had quietly helped countless neighbors over the years and asked nothing in return. They buried him on a hill overlooking his ranch, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, in soil he had worked and loved for nearly 50 years. Thea lived for 2 more years after his death, years filled with her children and grandchildren, with the memories of a life well lived. She never remarried, never even considered it. Ethan had been her great love, her partner in all things, and she was content to carry his memory until they could be reunited. When her time came, she died the same way Ethan had, peacefully and surrounded by love. Her last words, spoken to Sarah who sat beside her bed, were simple. "Tell him I am coming. Tell him I kept my promise. I stayed for life just like he asked." They buried her beside Ethan, and at her request, the The stone carving he had made for their 40th anniversary was placed between their graves, a testament to the moment that had started everything. The inscription reads simply, "Ethan and Thea Brennan, partners, lovers, forever." Their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that continued to prosper, in the schoolhouse where Sarah taught using her mother's methods, in the community they had helped build and strengthen. People told their story for generations. The tale of the blizzard and the lost woman and the cowboy who asked her to stay until spring. But more than the story, more than the legend it became, was the simple truth at its heart. That love can find us when we least expect it, that second chances are possible, and that sometimes the greatest adventure is not in running away, but in staying and building something beautiful from the wreckage of our pasts. The ranch house still stood decades later, weathered but strong, maintained by their descendants who understood they were stewards of something precious. The original cabin where it all began remained too, preserved and protected, its rough walls holding the memory of that first winter when two lost souls found each other in the storm and chose to build a shelter that would last far longer than any structure of wood and stone. And on cold winter nights when the wind howled down from the mountains, when snow piled high and the world turned white and dangerous, the people in that house would gather by the fire and tell the story again. They would talk about courage and chance, about the strength it takes to trust someone else with your broken pieces, about the magic that can happen when you open your door to a stranger and invite them to stay not just until spring, but for life. Because in the end, that was the real miracle. Not that Thea survived the blizzard, though that was remarkable enough, but that both she and Ethan survived the storms inside themselves, the guilt and fear and loneliness that had frozen them more thoroughly than any winter ever could. They thawed each other, warmed each other, and in doing so created something that outlasted them both. A family, a home, a love story for the ages. The land they had claimed and worked and loved continued to roll beneath the Wyoming sky, still wild, still beautiful, still holding the promise that drew people west in search of something better. And somewhere in that land, in the soil that held their remains, in the wind that sang through the grasslands, in the hearts of everyone who heard their story, Ethan and Thea lived on, eternally young, eternally in love, eternally grateful for the day a blizzard brought a lost woman to a lonely cowboy's door and changed both their lives forever.